Good morning, good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining us on the last day of the summer study. I hope you've had a great time over the last few days. I'm Ram Naranamurthy. I'm the lead for the Buildings program at EPRI, and along with my colleague Phil Markham, who will introduce himself, we are happy to have you attend Panel 6, which is Utilities in the Future. Living in what seems like Armageddon the last few days with rolling blackouts, fires, demand response, PSPS events, it just reiterates the interaction between the utilities, what happens on the utility side and what happens on the building side. And we have a great panel of speakers today who will dive deeper into how to leverage customer insights for both energy efficiency and flexibility, a topic that seems to be rising in importance in the last few days. So thank you again for joining. Just to first thank our sponsors. We would like to thank all our gold sponsors, our silver sponsors, and our bronze sponsors. Gold sponsors, E for the Future, Energize Connecticut, Eversource, National Grid, SoCal Gas, SMUD, and United Illuminating. Our silver sponsors, ComEd, the Energy Coalition, Energy Trust of Oregon, Johnson Controls, NEA, and TRC, Samsung, and On24, who's also helping us with the virtual webcast. And finally, our bronze sponsors, EIC, Opinion Dynamics, NYSERDA, and Guidehouse. So thank you very much for the sponsors for making this possible, and we look forward to some great interaction. A few housekeeping items. If you have any questions for the speakers, please enter that on the Q&A tab that's at the bottom. We will be addressing the questions at the end of the speakers, at the end of the discussions from the three speakers, and we will read out the questions for the speakers to answer. With that, let me turn it over to Phil Markham, who will take us through the panel. Phil, you have the floor. Let me introduce the first speaker, which is Jessica Branderson, who's one of our leads for the conference too. Jessica is a leader in the energy efficiency group at the building technologies group at Lawrence Berkeley National Labs. And with that, Jessica, if you can take it, you have the floor.
Thanks, Ram. I want to first acknowledge my team members in this work, Elliot Crow, Samir Tuzani, and Sam Fernandez at Berkeley Lab, and Margaret Sheridan, now retired from SMUD. I'm happy to present to you our work in meter-based assessment of the spatial and temporal benefits of a DSM portfolio. I'm going to set us up with a little context before getting into the details. We know that our carbon goals have been driving increased levels of renewable generation, and that's been changing our net system load profiles. We're talking a lot about ducks, how fat their bellies are, the desire to get them flying and flattening those curves. On the infrastructure side, we're increasingly thinking about non-wires alternatives to defer capital investments for upgrades. And this all brings us to a place where valuing and optimizing our efficiency is requiring us to think about metrics other than our historic kind of lumped annual total BTU or kilowatt hour savings. In this work, I'm going to share how we've used AMI data to understand when and where on the grid savings occur, and how that helps us to link grid planning and EE program delivery. I'm going to go through three questions. First, what are efficiency savings at different locations in the distribution grid, and how do those savings impact energy used at those locations? Second, what's the hourly savings shape at different points in the grid, and how do those shapes vary with season? And finally, what can we say about the impact of the EE programs on peak demand? I'm going to get us grounded in some definitions and methodology before digging into results. And first, I want to talk about data aggregation and levels of analysis. Our analysis covered a scope of 51 feeders and 12 substations in the SMUD territory. The first thing we did was we had labeled data on which meters corresponded to accounts that had participated in programs in a given year versus those that had not. So for each feeder, we aggregated the loads from the participants and from the non-participants into a single time series that's shown in green, and we paired that with outside air temperature. To remove confounding factors, we kicked out any accounts that were known to have customer moves during the analysis period or customer-cited PV or electric vehicles. So first stage of analysis at the feeder level. Then we did the same method. We just rolled up to all of the meter accounts associated with a given substation across each of those 12 substations. Finally, we looked at the sum total of all substations and all the meters downstream. This was of interest to SMUD as a solid proxy for the total system-wide or territory system. So we're going to talk about feeder, substation, and total system proxy levels of analysis. As for the savings analysis, we took 2015 as a baseline year, 2018 as a reporting year for savings. In the middle, we had folks who had either participated or not participated in programs in that intervening period. First thing we did was take those aggregated load profiles and fit a baseline model to them. We used a gradient boosting machine. I'll refer you to the paper for the details. The independent variables were time of week, time of day, day of week, season, and outside air temperature. We forward projected the model into the 2018 analysis period, model predictions, and the difference between the actual consumption was taken as the savings. We calculated savings at each of those grid levels, the territory, proxy, substation, and feeder. And then we broke things out temporally. We looked at an annual total savings. We broke that into savings for each of 24 hours in the year, and then further broke that out hourly savings by season. In every case, we used a sort of the information around program participants and non-participants as a kind of quasi-comparison group and sanity check. So I'll be referring to that in the results I share. As for metrics, the first that I'll talk about is a very standard intuitive percent savings or fractional savings. That is how much was saved relative to baseline prediction. So if you predicted 100 units, saved 10 units, that would be a 10% fractional savings. When we wanted to understand impact of savings on the energy consumed at different points in the grid infrastructure, we need a new metric. We need one that considers as the denominator the total energy used at that point in the grid. So consider that, for example, this blue rectangle. Say that's total energy used at a substation. The vertical strip on the left might be energy used by the program participants, the remainder the non-participants. We could then take the relative savings of the EE participants, divide by the total energy used at that substation, and get a fraction there, and do the same for the program non-participants. These are the two metrics that I'll focus on throughout the talk. So I'll step into some findings. First, with what are the savings at different points in the grid and how much do they impact energy used at those points? And I'll start at that sum across 12 substations as a territory proxy kind of total level. Starting with the two bar charts on the left-hand side, this is fractional savings. EE participants are shown in red, non-participants in blue. Significant savings across the EE portfolio, over 12% from the EE participants. We do see a reduction in consumption between 2015 and 18 for the non-participants. That's shown in the blue bar. That's a little over 2.5%, but our sanity check holds at this point. So we've got the EE folks saving a lot more than the exogenous or however occurring reduction in use from the non-participants. We move to the right bar chart. We want to understand, how do those 12% savings achieved by the EE customers manifest as a reduction in energy used at the total proxy grid level? You see, the height of the bars flips on us. So the relative impact on the grid for the EE folks was a little over 1%, but from the non-EE group, almost 2.5%. What that means is, or rather that's a result of the order of magnitude more non-participants and the fact that their use was also going down versus those, really solid 12% savings from the EE group, but the fact that there were so many fewer of them. So we could then take a look and do the same kind of analysis at each of 12 substations. First, I'll note that our sanity check holds. The EE group saves more than the non-EE group. That means the pink bar is higher than the turquoise in 11 out of 12 cases. The savings that are achieved by the EE customers range from near zero at the substation level to in excess of 25%. Now let's look at how that manifests as an impact on energy used at the substation. Here we see a change from the total proxy level. At this point, out 5 of the 12 substations, the energy efficiency savings are actually outweighing the impacts of the non-EE group. We've got a range of those impacts from anywhere from near zero, because we had near zero savings, but now all the way up to 5%. And these are the substations for which those efficiency impacts are now quite visible and material. Now, I'm not going to show you 51 paired bar charts for each of the feeders in our analysis, but we'll give you a summary. First, that sanity check, EE saving more than non-EE, that held up pretty consistently at 75% of those 51 feeders. I want to remind folks that this is findings from just wherever efficiency landed on the grid. There was no intentional targeting of the location of delivery nor of the measure types. So the average impacts of the efficiency savings achieved as we move from the feeder level upstream to the total proxy ranged 1.4, 1.3%. This, interestingly and nicely, was in line with what the planning forecasts are that folks in the grid side of the house rely upon. When we look at that total territory-wide proxy level, even though efficiency was pulling 12% savings, the impact on energy use was lost to the reductions in consumption that we observed from the non-participants, and that was just because of the small number of program participants. When we moved down to the feeder level, there was a lot more variability in savings as well as the impact of those savings. I'll move to question 2 and start digging into hourly savings shapes and how those savings shapes vary with season at different points in the grid. Couple analysis notes. I'm going to show weekdays only. We're going to continue with that comparison of the EE and the non-EE groups to understand how much credence to put into our hourly savings calculations. And I'm going to show fractional savings only, not the impacts of those savings on the grid. First, I will show results at that total proxy level, and we'll look at how hourly savings vary seasonally. So first thing to note, Savings shown as a percent on the y-axis, on the x-axis, 24 hours of the day. The red line is the EE participants, the blue line is the non-EE group. There's significant separation between those two, and that's good. That's our sanity check panning out. Savings are ranging from 10% to excess of 15, and there's a clear peak between around noon and 1 p.m. We can break these out now in the quad chart here. I'm showing clockwise from upper left, winter, spring, fall, and summer. The profiles are generally the same. We still have good separation between the EE and non-EE participants, so we believe those hourly calculations. And we see that in summer, the peak has shifted to a little bit earlier in the day. Now, how about if we look now at the substation level? So again, on the far left, I'm showing that total grid proxy level, each of 24 hours, the percent savings from the EE and non-EE groups. And then we break out in the 3x4 each of our substations. Several substations, their profiles kind of match that total territory proxy level. They've got those nice curves and peaks again between around 11 and 1. But what I will note is that there's a lot more variation in these savings profiles. Some hours we're even seeing negative savings, and for those gray shaded vertical portions, we've actually lost signal to noise. That's where our EE is not clearly discernible from our non-EE, so we put less faith into those hourly calculations. How about if we look seasonally? On the left in that single plot, I'm showing the total proxy level for summer. And again, how does that play out, those hourly savings shapes for each of the 12 substations? I'll highlight that two substations stand out as a little wonky. Those were noted as being dominated by industrial or single customer loads and more anomalous in their expected behaviors. Still lots of variation, but there's very few portions of gray shading where we don't have a solid calculation of the hourly savings result. The picture changes when we move into winter. You're seeing a lot more gray across those hourly savings calculations. That signature is less consistently discernible. So we put this all together and think about what's the picture as we move from the total territory proxy to substation and to feeder. We start to see that at the total level, all hours of the day, all seasons, we have a really strong hourly savings signal. That decays a little bit at the substation level, and by the time we get to feeders, we've lost more hours of the day in which we can confidently give an hourly number. The next thing is that if you look across seasons at whatever the point in the grid that you care about, summer is where we've got the strongest savings signal. So our last research question was, what's the impact of those efficiency programs on peak demand? And what we did was take the single highest load day in our analysis period. That was a day in July in 2018 for SMUD. And we made an hourly prediction for that day. I'm showing in the two plots here, the red line, the left hand is EE participants, the right hand chart is the non-participants. The solid red line is the predicted load, and the solid black line is the metered load. If you stopped there, you would think this is amazing. The EE program participants, even on the peak load day, are consuming less than they did in the baseline, and the same is not true of the non-participants. But the picture's not so clear. The red dashed lines represent a 99% confidence interval around our prediction. So the fact that both our prediction and our metered load fall within that means that we couldn't actually statistically discern the baseline prediction from the metered load. So we have high uncertainty in trying to predict peak day loads using a model that was trained on data from a whole year of consumption 2 years prior. This is certainly an area of future work for us. We didn't quite nail this question. I want to move now into some takeaways and some concluding thoughts across this body of work. First, that highlighting that meter-based analytics can give disaggregated savings patterns at the grid level and give really useful insights at specific substations as well as feeders. Most fun of this whole project was that this gave us common ground to connect grid planning and forecast business units and their perspectives with customer solutions and program delivery. The dialogue that this sparked and created was just really fun. Using those measured values helped to really make efficiency real to both groups. I'll kind of issue a call to action. This approach can be used right now. You can track efficiency program impacts for their temporal and locational benefits. We could move forward. I'm very interested to use these kinds of analyses to intentionally target future EE and non-wires alternative efforts, and in so doing, really optimize the value of the efficiency that we're delivering. We've barely scratched the surface in this work here. There's many opportunities for ongoing discovery, and I welcome anyone with similar interests to please contact me. We'd love to collaborate. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you. Maybe we have time for maybe one clarifying question. Let me pick a question. So the one question that came in was, are all the EE participants from all sectors or just residential?
All sectors, all programs.
Great. Maybe one more quick question. So for peak demand savings, why did you use a 99% confidence level? It seems overly restrictive. Did the conclusions change if you use 90 or 95%?
Well, that's actually the widest. It gives us the biggest range. So that was like least conservative, actually, and we still found that we couldn't discern the effects.
Thank you, Jessica. With that,
thank you.
Thank you for your time, and we'll come back to more audience questions at the end of the presentations. With that, let me transfer it to Phil. Phil, are you on? Energy Investment Corporation, and she'll be presenting on the results of a flexible load management program. So with that, Abigail, you have the floor.
Thank you. So yes, I'll talk about our paper, All Carrot, No Stick, a flexible load management reward program. And so this work would not have been possible without all of our collaborators from Efficiency Vermont, Green Mountain Power, Dynamic Organics. And so Efficiency Vermont is Vermont's energy efficiency utility. And Efficiency Vermont harnessed our vast customer relationships and building energy expertise to enroll customers in the pilot and estimate the pilot impacts. And Green Mountain Power was our utility partner, and Dynamic Organics was another collaborator that was key to setting up customer controls and customer engagement. And I apologize, my camera doesn't appear to be working. So we had a few simple goals for the first iteration of the pilot. We wanted to verify the customer's flexible load ability and its relationship to the grid. We wanted to test our designed incentive structure and ensure that it was enough to encourage behavior change from participants. And we wanted to ultimately begin proving the value of load management to Vermont and take the learnings from a more traditional demand response type structure to move us towards a more advanced load management program. And so load management is a key part in reaching our carbon reduction goals. And so as New England's grid is evolving, the time that we use energy is becoming more and more important. And so this graph shows the normalized New England load as well as the solar, hydro, and wind. And so we can see if we were to combine the shapes of these renewable curves, they would not meet the shape of the New England load. This is why renewables only account for around 10% of New England's generation, and having wider adoption is more difficult. And these renewables are very static. Most hydro facilities have a small or non-existent reservoirs to hold energy. And it's, of course, impossible to control wind or solar without having large amounts of battery storage. And so with these constraints, load management is one way that we can help adopt more renewables. And so we can also look at the specific effect that solar has on the Vermont grid. The top graph shows the relationship between solar production and a measure of Vermont's peaks. And so we looked at the ratio between the daily maximum and daytime minimum. And so as solar production increases, we see more pronounced evening peaks and lower daytime values. And so these pronounced peaks have real ramifications for the grid. One being the cost of energy. So in fact, there are 13 specific hours of the year tied to peak demand that drive approximately 25% of customers' energy bill costs. And so one of these hours is related to the forward capacity market. There's 1 hour per year tied to New England's peak consumption. And then the other 12 hours are tied to the regional network service fees, which is the monthly Vermont peak hour. And so with load management, we can focus on peak demand and reduce these costs as well as carbon emissions. And so now that I've kind of given some background on the value of load management, I'll give an overview of our pilot methods. And I think I'd like to just, so I'll give an overview here. So Efficiency Vermont enrolled a variety of customers to represent the commercial and industrial loads from a wide variety of facilities. This ranged from colleges and office buildings to natural gas facilities and wastewater treatment plants. And so customers benefited from upfront and continuous engagement from energy consultants throughout the pilot. They also were engaged using a dashboard built by Dynamic Organics. This showed when peaks were likely, as well as what the real-time and forecasted load was for the grid. This kept customers engaged in the value for peak demand and so that they could make good decisions on how to respond to peak events and relate that to their building operations. Another key element of the pilot's success was to enable flexible load and control systems. And so typically, HVACs and industrial process loads have been viewed as more static and not usually called upon for demand response or flexible load. But what we found was that with assistance from energy consultants, that the load is actually very flexible and behavioral change was all that was needed. For example, an industrial site can change how they schedule their operations to avoid grid constraints without losing sight of their total operational goals. And so updated building management systems are also critical to translate the signals from the utility into actionable control sequences and building towards this interactive grid. And so this ensured controls were reliable. It allows for more complex logic systems and cost-effective enrollment when a BMS is already installed. And so Efficiency Vermont is developing a controls program to update building management systems throughout Vermont. And this has really a two-stage benefit. First being the energy efficiency savings, and then it better sets us up to enable flexibility. And so this chart shows an example of how the control systems were installed for a college's rooftop units. And using these paired strategies, we were able to achieve a 63% peak reduction for this building. And so now that the controls are set up, the utility can now start calling peak events. And so the notifications were sent around 24 hours in advance and were about 5 hours in duration. And so the time window ranged depending on the targeted peak. So in the summer, the windows tended to be a little bit later than the windows for the winter or the FCM peak. And the customer incentives were really driven by the savings that occur from these fees related to the FCM and RNS. And so these fees change each year based on the infrastructure, reliability, and administrative costs. And the forecasted trend is that the RNS rates will be going up over the next few years, and the FCM will go down a little bit. But our utility partner really sees this as a good monetizable value stream to get load management off the ground in Vermont. And so Green Mountain Power rewards customers for 70% of their peak reduction during the peak hour. And when designing this incentive structure, our Green Mountain Power was really focused on how does this affect participants, but also non-participants. And we needed to make sure that non-participants were not adversely affected. And so the remaining 30%, once this is up to scale, will then be redistributed to non-participants. And so to calculate the customer's monthly credit based on their performance, we look at the customer's counterfactual load or baseline that represents what the customer would have done in absence of this load event. And so we then compute the difference during this peak hour and use this to calculate their monthly credit. And so the customer payment really hinges on our ability to be able to accurately estimate what they would have done in absence of the event. And so to do this, we trained an autoregressive moving average model or time series model on AMI data. We really tried to use AMI data and avoid installing a lot of submeters to keep this a scalable approach going forward. And so this model takes a linear combination of previous load as well as temperature. And we did a lot of feature engineering to explain the time of week and hour of day patterns that we see in the data. And we ended up using a Fourier series to model these patterns. And we saw a reduction in error of about 6% compared to a naive averaging method that doesn't take into account the correlation between the load values. So I won't dive too deep here, but feel free to see our paper or ask questions if you're interested. And so now that I've kind of laid a groundwork for our pilot methods, there are some key results that I'd like to touch on. So this graph shows the amount of load that 10 customers were able to shift during a summer peak season, split by the commercial and industrial. And so we had about 5 customers in each. And on the far left bar is the impact for the FCM peak. And this really shows the power of having a larger incentive value. And then for the remainder of the summer, we saw that for the regional peaks, the performance was not as high for the industrial customers. And so they were not able to sustain reduction for the full 5-hour peak window without compromising their operational requirements. And so here's an example of how the cost of not operating at a natural gas facility was not offset by the reward during a regional RNS peak. And so the facility was not able to shut down for the full window. They shut down for the second half, and you can see relative to the baseline during the peak window, the customer's usage was actually higher. So this yields no reward for this customer for that peak. But for most of the commercial sites and some of the industrial sites, they were able to reduce for the full event, since most of them didn't have as much impact on their operations. And so as long as the utility forecasts these peaks correctly, they received payment relative to their baseline. I'm actually going to skip this slide for time. Sorry about that. So one of the key learnings that the team took from this first iteration of the pilot was that with all of the utilities' demand management programs, regional peak events were often being shifted to a different day or a different hour due to the responses during these events. And so this graph shows the Vermont load and the day ahead forecast. And the forecast anticipated that there would be an evening peak. But with the response of all the assets, it was moved to a morning peak. And so I label this as the unrewarded effort, because the way the pilot is designed, participants only get rewarded if the response occurred on that peak hour. So what this means is that the risk of peak forecasting is landing on the participant and not just on the utility. And so given our learnings from this first iteration, the team has developed a second iteration of the pilot, taking all of these learnings. And the first thing that we wanted to address was the unrewarded effort. And so we do this by instead rewarding for the average performance across all event periods. And this will remove the risk of the peak forecasting from the customer payment. Additionally, we are limiting the second iteration of the pilot to automated control systems. This means that events will provide minimal interruption to business operations and can be controlled more liberally within each facility. And with automation controls, we can optimize across the participant groups and create a more homogeneous response on the grid. The impact can be more fine-tuned so that we avoid snapbacks, we can flatten up the ramp and fill the solar curve. Automation also guarantees that the response the utility will receive from a customer, given that they don't opt out of an event. So this assists in the utility's planning and management when looking at multiple different demand management programs. Finally, the utility is still interested in seeking the value from RNS peaks. And so to do this, we can increase the likelihood of calling the peaks correctly by calling more events without inconveniencing the customer. And the team also plans to explore other value streams, such as filling up the solar curve. Although it's not clearly monetizable, this will begin to prove the concepts and value for the Vermont grid. And so some key takeaways are that with the correct incentives in help from energy consultants, behavioral change can enable flexibility. And despite the challenges of the first iteration, we were able to show the impact of peak reduction and the value of flexible load management. And finally, the team has designed a second iteration of the pilot that harnesses automation and a change incentive scheme to really tackle these challenges. And our ultimate objective is to design and build a load management system that is scalable and impactful for the grid and customers. And so I'd like to thank ACEEE for hosting virtual summer study. And it's been a great experience, and I'm honored to be presenting with such a knowledgeable panel. And I'd like to thank all of our collaborators, and please reach out to myself if you or our co-authors if you have any questions.
Thank you, Abigail. This is Phil Markham from Southern Company Research and Development, co-hosting with Ram. Sorry about the communication problems earlier. Abigail, one question I wanted to ask, which came through, which I think is an interesting one. I think you have probably some really good insight on this question. The question was, how do we better project long-term load management, load flexibility to be able to plan? Basically, how do we fit that into generation planning cycles? What type of data do we need? What kind of resolution of the data do we need? Obviously, in California right now, people are feeling, even before the fires, not having the reserve there. How do we run the system efficiently so we can leverage that resource, but not get caught short? Have you got any thoughts on that? How do we incorporate into the planning cycles?
Yeah, I think through the discussions with our utility partners, that being able to have an estimate of the impact when you pull certain, levers in their quiver of demand management, being able to know, how will this shape the grid? What will happen there? And so kind of understanding the impacts of these pilots will really help the utilities to plan and better understand how this affects the grid. Great.
So I think what I heard was basically data.
I mean, I think at least in Vermont, we're in the very beginning stages of understanding how this interacts with our regional grid. And so, I think for us, definitely, it's just more learning and understanding how can we, forecast the load that the grid will have, but also how these pilots and programs impact the grid. So kind of two-stage understanding there. Thanks.
Excellent. Thank you. Great. And we hope to have more questions for Jessica and Abigail at the end as well. I want to introduce our next panelist, Richard Rostad. He is a research engineer with FSEC Energy Center in Cocoa, Florida. Richard, just in the interest of time, I'll let you take it away. Thanks. It looks like we're having some communication difficulties. So what I may do is, and Ram, feel free to chime in here. Another question for Abigail. Quite a few questions came through.
Can you hear me now? Hello?
Yep. Yes, Richard, go ahead. We hear you.
Oh, I wasn't supposed to control my own mic. That's what they told me. Okay. I'll start over. Okay, so a recent program was with the utility company in Florida that wanted to analyze their energy conservation programs. And they wanted to know if each one of their programs were viable in that the rebates they were providing to the customer were a good investment and they were getting a return based on the energy savings and peak demand reductions they expected. At the FSEC Energy Research Center, Danny Parker, Robin Vieira, and Karen Fenady helped on this project. So the goals were to analyze the EC program value using the utility-provided AMI meter data. The utility company provided 4 years worth of data from 2015 to 2018, and this was 15-minute energy data. We were to determine the energy and demand savings for a specific EC program, specifically here, high-efficiency heat pumps. And we wanted to use industry-recognized analysis methods, which I will talk through the methods we used, and they progressed in their level of detail. So first we tried, first we looked at current versus future participants. The utility company provided us with a list of EC program participants. We picked out a group of sites, AMI meter sites, that were participating at the time and also were a future participant but had not yet installed the rebate. We also looked at a before and after protocol, which I'm sure most researchers are familiar with, where we look at the data before the retrofit is installed and then after. There's no regression to weather in this method. And then we took that method and we evaluated the before and after sample with a regression against outdoor weather. These first three were averages of the entire data set. So all the sites were averaged into one time series. And then we, as a fourth method, we took those before and after samples and we looked at the individual meter data and we regressed each one of those against weather. And then finally, the simulation evaluation is which utility companies will typically use to evaluate their EC programs. So the current versus future participants, we selected participants that had installed a high efficiency heat pump by 2016, and we called that the rebate group. And from their list, we also selected participants that wanted to participate but had not yet installed the heat pump, and that was our control group. And this is an unpaired sample, meaning that any AMI site in the rebate group was not corresponded in the control group. So it's unpaired, and we expected higher variance in the data samples. This was a same year analysis, which hopefully would minimize the difference due to weather and changes in participant energy consumption over time. So when you're looking at time series data, it's possible that people could add more plug loads, change their habits, occupancy can change. Looking at the same year would hopefully minimize that impact. The before and after protocol compared the control group that I just spoke about in 2016 with the consumption in 2018, and it was January through August of each year. The same homes were used pre and post, so this was a paired sample. For each home in the control group, there was a corresponding home in the rebate group. The statistical variance here should be lower, yet there were still going to be weather differences that may impact the results because you're looking at a long period of time. Also, consumer energy consumption may change. So we took that group And we wanted to evaluate the before and after group using regression against outdoor weather. And this is an actual data set from the SEER 16 heat pump program showing the 2016 versus 2018 after the retrofit. And you can see that the data, if you've looked at residential homes, this is what homes typically look like. This is the profile versus outdoor weather. And this is the average of all the sites in each of the groups, not individual sites. So we regressed each one of these groups to provide cooling energy use and heating energy use. Oddly enough, in this figure, you can see on the left, the solid red line is the pre-data and the dotted line is the post-data. So it actually appears that the energy use in the heating season has actually increased. We used Orlando weather data at the international airport to regress against all the sites in the region we were interested in, which was very near or in Orlando. And finally, we did an individual account regression with summation. So we took that group of sites that we had just analyzed as a whole on average, and we analyzed each individual site against weather. And the figure you're looking at here is not from the heat pump data because we hadn't programmatically applied these ideas yet, but this gives you an idea of what we were looking at. So in this figure, in the top left, you'll see the daily energy use versus outdoor weather. This is pre-retrofit. And the bottom left green is the daily energy use after the retrofit. You can kind of start to get a feel here that there is a little bit of savings. The top right figure is the 15-minute kilowatt hour data over the 4-year period. The two red lines there denote the time period in which we believe the retrofit was installed. And if the utility company did not give us a specific date, we had to assume a range. And those lines tell us that we believe the heat pump was installed in that time frame. And on the left side of those lines, you can see what the 15-minute energy use looked like before and then after. And here again, it appears that there were savings. And the good thing about looking at the time series data like this is you can start to see then gaps in the data, whether the energy use post-retrofit has increased or whether there were major changes in energy use. You get a feel for what this building is doing. The bottom right is the summation of the regression pre and post in both the cooling and heating season, and you can then see the red line is pre and the blue line is post, and there does appear to be savings here. To look at the individual account regression gives you a little bit more information now, because since you've regressed cooling and heating energy per site, you can then start to get information on heating energy and cooling energy. And then when you sum up the energy over the year, you have the annual energy. And then you get an idea of what a baseline energy use is without HVAC. And in these figures, you see the SEER 15, 16, 17, and 18 data that we accumulated. And just as a reference, the SEER 15 shows about 15,000 kilowatt hours. And the heating and cooling energy show about 7,000 kilowatt hours. And here in Florida, in the off-season, my electric bill is about $90. Or if I take off a $10 customer charge, that's about $80 I'm paying for energy. And at 12 cents a kilowatt hour, that's about 8,000 kilowatt hours. So these numbers actually do start to line up with real information. And you have a lot of information here you can begin to look at. Our heating season is rather short. That's why the heating numbers are small. And we have a fairly intensive cooling season here. So you can see that the cooling season can be about 40%, which people understand as far as HVAC energy use goes. So we'll sum this information up to get the annual energy use. We'll apply that to the before and after retrofit cases, and we can find a savings here and apply a percent savings number. Now, these numbers are quite high, the savings numbers, that is, in the 20 to 30% range, some lower than that, of course. But you have to remember that we're comparing a known SEER with a system that we had no information on. So we don't know if we replaced a 10 SEER unit or a 14 SEER unit that was 10 years or 15 years old and was operating very poorly. These are the true savings numbers that we measured through AMI data that we could report to the utility company. For the simulation evaluation, we used the Energy Gauge USA product that we use here in Florida to rate homes with Orlando Weather. And these results are the weighted average results of many different runs we made with different types of homes, different aged homes, different code compliance. To give you this table here, we averaged some of those results to show what the results look like. In the simulations, we selected the SEER, and the simulation itself sized the unit based on the building for that input deck. This is the historic method used by the utility companies, and the utility company really asked us to give them the savings of the SEER 15 and up heat pumps with respect to SEER 14 units, which was easy to do in the simulation. And you can see here the results show the energy savings progressing larger as the SEER increases, as does the demand savings. And these savings are with respect to 14 SEER. When we looked at the AMI data, we didn't have any idea of what the previous unit was, so we weren't able to get them referenced to the 14 SEER. And in fact, there were no homes that had installed a 14 SEER as part of a rebate program because that was the code compliant SEER level at the time. To compare these methods now, which is what we really wanted to do to determine which method was going to be best for us for AMI meter data analysis, we took the current versus future results by SEER, because we separated out SEER as one of the key features, and we show the savings here as the current versus future method progress from SEER 15 upward. We don't see really more savings as the SEER increases. You have to remember here that we were comparing a non-paired sample of the rebate participants and those participants that had not yet installed a system. So we didn't have a real good feel for, what differences there were in the buildings or even differences in the systems they had installed at the time. As we went to the before and after sample now, we start getting better savings numbers, yet there still isn't a good trend towards higher SEER saves more energy. The before and after with regression now starts to show a trend of increasing savings by SEER, and the individual account regression also shows that same increasing savings as SEER increases. And to compare to the simulation, where we see a few percent savings over and above SEER 14, and that few percent increases as the SEER increases as well, you can start seeing that there's a trend towards increasing savings from the AMI data when you're looking at the last two methods, and both of those regress against weather. Look at this. As far as sample size, if you can see these small numbers I put on here, it was too busy for me to use this as a key slide, but I just wanted you to see the sample sizes. We had, in the current versus future, we had about 200 or 500 current versus future. And as the SEER increased, the sample size started to drop, and that was assumably because the higher cost of the equipment, people weren't willing to invest, and more people went for the lower SEER units. And as we went to the before and after sample, there were even fewer yet, because we were restricted to the control group, or the rebate group, to deal with. And then when we started adding the regression in, those samples even dropped a little further because we started realizing that some of the homes didn't match well with weather, and we dropped them out of the comparison. Now, looking at the final results here as a bar chart, we can see that the current versus future method on the left didn't show savings in all groups, in all SEER groups. And when we moved towards the before and after, we started to now see a trend, because this was a paired sample and the variance in the differences were smaller. We can start seeing a trend in savings versus increasing SEER. And then when we add the regression to weather to that, it even becomes more pronounced and in the right direction. And then when we look at the individual regressions, we see that the trend now, in this case, I'm comparing to a SEER 15 because we didn't have 14 data. And the increasing savings versus SEER trend has the same slope as the simulation results. So as we progressed from these methods, adding more and more complexity and regressing against weather and then looking at the individual accounts, we started to get a better result. And we're getting general agreement between what the simulation showed. Now, some of the things that the utility should consider is, and what we found during this project was that the AMI data collection policy should actually be reviewed and look at the frequency and the storage requirements for all that data and the quality of data. And in this project, the frequency was 15-minute data. For the energy data, we looked at the daily energy consumption, and for the peak demand, we looked at the peak hour, which means we needed a better resolution. So we needed at least hourly data, and thankfully we had 15-minute energy data. And the energy conservation programs should keep more detailed records of the building characteristics and the equipment types, whether it's a 10 or 14 SEER was replaced, because that information can be useful during the analysis. And the results here reflect total building energy use savings instead of the actual EC program savings. Although the savings for the energy conservation program was our target, and we did the best we could to give the utility company that information, it's still the total building energy use that we were looking at, and any changes in occupancy behavior or, building performance, the plug loads, the scheduling, and things like that are going to be reflected in the results. And the final thing we did is, once we knew all this information on these different methods, we took that manual analysis that we did using Stata to do the statistics and spreadsheets to the final results, and we put all that information into a program to where we could then take the utility data, run it through the program, and spit out the final results, which took us 6 months to do for this initial heat pump energy conservation program. And then once we had the program, we ran the data from the other energy conservation programs through this program, and we finished up the last 7 or 8 EC programs in about another 4 to 6 months. So programmatically applying this methodology to AMI data really saves a lot of manpower and cost. And that's my presentation. Thank you.
Thank you, Richard. Thank you very much for your time. I think there's a couple of questions. I think we have about 10 minutes for questions. I'll take on one question for you, and then we'll go to the general questions from the audience. Richard, so where new thermostats installed with the heat pumps, are the additional savings possible with better setback scheduling capability of the new systems?
We did not have any information on the types of thermostats that were installed. I assume when the new heat pump was installed, they likely installed a new thermostat, but we didn't have any information on that. Okay. All we knew were the participants were in a specific energy conservation program, and we knew a little bit of their the date of install, and we also used a property database to get a little bit more information, but it didn't have anything on occupancy or scheduling or what type of thermostat.
Okay. And the other question we have, Richard, is what pieces of information about the buildings had the most value?
Had the less value?
Had the most value.
Had the most value? Well, I think, when you're looking at total building energy, you don't really know a lot of the characteristics of the building or the operation of that building unless you have more information. So I think one of the best things we did here was to use a property database, and given the AMI meter number, we were able to link that meter to the property database and pull out information on square footage, wall type, at times roof type, but we were still missing, occupancy data and scheduling, which is, extremely important when you're doing an analysis like this. But from the utilities perspective, what they're really interested in is what is the impact on the utility company. So if we take a step back and just look at the AMI data and see what that data shows, we can then tell the utility company what their programs are reaping versus their incentive payment to the customer.
Great. Phil, do you have any questions before we go to the audience?
Yeah, there's lots of questions that have come in. And so I think we'll throw it back to Jessica because she was up first. I think we want to hear from her again. You had lots of questions, Jessica, and I know that you've seen them and read them and addressed them in the chat here, but I don't think the whole audience can see that. Do you want to address them? They kind of fell under two themes, didn't they, about program impact and statistical certainty?
Yes. Thank you. Thanks, everyone, for the great questions. Please feel free to continue contacting me if I did not sufficiently address them or if you have others. This is exciting work that I could talk about all day long. I got a lot of questions about how the results would break out for specific programs. So I reported out the program portfolio as a whole. This is actually analysis that we're conducting right now, is to look at very specific program offerings and apply the same analysis approach. I also got a lot of questions around the uncertainty analysis, and I'm going to show this again here. So the first thing that people, very rightly cued into was like, hey, wait a minute, why 99%? Isn't that a really high bar? And what happened if you give a little there? How do the results change? And the first thing I'll say is I absolutely appreciate that we don't necessarily need 99% confidence on our efficiency findings. We aren't medical trials. We don't need that. What I will note, however, is that even if you started shrinking those dashed lines, there's not a heck of a lot of space between the solid red and the solid black. And so it'd still be like really difficult to discern statistically those lines from one another. For the non-program participants, the lines are like right on top of each other for most of the day. So thank you all for those questions. And I could go back and ask my partners and team members to create these plots with, different uncertainty bands there. I don't think the conclusion would materially change. And this is definitely an area of future work for us to make these predictions with more confidence. I got some other interesting questions that I would like to take offline through direct engagement with folks around what can we do next and how can we apply these types of findings in the field for settlement, et cetera. So I'll stop there and pass on to my co-presenters.
Thank you, Jessica. Abigail, a question for you. There was a question that came in about with the industrial facilities that were able to respond automatically. what kind of software and hardware solutions did they have? Did they already have them in place? I think ultimately what we're trying to get to there is how scalable is that solution? You know, how many of the customers already have that? Doesn't take much to integrate, and how many customers in Vermont would have not a small, maybe upfront cost to get that set up?
Yeah. So for right now, the pilots or the customers that we're working with now, only a couple of them have up-to-date building management systems. But I think going forward, Efficiency Vermont is really investing in the building management systems across the state. And so once that system is up to date, our partner Dynamic Organics has been developing a software solution to connect the building management system to the utility. Once that software is fully developed, then the connection to the BMS is relatively cost effective. The big lift is installing the BMS and updating that throughout the state.
Great, thank you. Ram, I'm going to let you pick a question in a second. And just while, Ram, maybe you're thinking of one, just wanted to say thank you to everyone who's participated and submitted papers for this panel. There were some really good papers and really got Ram and I thinking and the other reviewers thinking. So thank you. Ram, do you want to pick a few questions and then close us out?
Yes. Sure, thanks, Paul. Let me actually turn over to Richard now. I think we are going around in a circle. But Richard, there's a question about how does natural gas and natural gas efficiency play into this scenario?
Natural gas and natural gas efficiency?
Yes.
I guess only to the extent of the heat that's added to the space for those types of appliances, because we were looking strictly at electric meters. Now, if we were to look at gas meter consumption, we could provide the same type of analysis.
Great, thanks, Richard. One more question for you. What are the advantages, if any, of the AMI data method of calculating savings compared to simulation-based?
What are the advantages of? Well, the advantage is cost, because for the last 30 years, we've been installing data loggers in homes and commercial buildings to either sub-meter or get the total meter. Now we have AMI meter data, and either researchers who can get access to that AMI meter data, and this data is on the utility company servers, which is like Fort Knox, but if they provide that data, you can analyze it, or the utility companies themselves can look at that data and analyze their own programs. And even some of the types of programs that were talked about earlier could be used to provide, savings information on those programs. Great.
Thanks, Richard. So again, I just wanted to thank all the presenters. It's been great presentations. Just to maybe we'll go around the table, have some what I call final takeaways from each of the presenters from from the research you did, and especially maybe in light of some of the current events that we are seeing. Do you want to? You've seen the questions that have come in. Do you want to address the questions and leave us with some final takeaways for the session? So maybe we'll go in the same order. Jessica, do you want to take 30 seconds and talk about the future, about what you're trying to do to extend this work and how you think it will be useful?
Thank you. I'm very excited to extend this analysis and to apply it in other locations. And most importantly, I think we saw what was possible with a retrospective look on data. What did we happen to get from these programs that were, remember, quite effective, over 12% savings portfolio-wide? I would really like to work with folks on more proactive targeting and how we can do this in a very forward-looking way so that we get that maximum value out of our efficiency. Call me, people. Let's collaborate.
Thank you, Jessica. Abigail, do you have any comments, especially from what you're seeing in California right now with the power shortages in the evenings and the work you guys did?
Sorry, you cut out a little bit at the end. Could you say that one more time?
I was just trying to say, I mean, do you have any takeaway messages? And especially, I mean, for many of us who live in California and even for others, right, we are looking at, hey, what is happening with with the demand flexibility in the evenings and the resources that are available? And I think some of the work we have done might be extensible. So do you have any thoughts and any final takeaways?
Yeah, I think kind of our big goal here is to really move away from kind of the traditional demand response framework, which was kind of how our first work was really designed around, and get this into a place that's more advanced and can really be more customizable and to exactly how the grid is reacting and behaving, so that we can really avoid these constraints that are causing so much problems on the grid. I mean, Vermont is seeing similar impacts of solar and renewables that California is seeing. So kind of like just moving beyond this demand response into more advanced programs, and how do we get those to scale?
Great. Thanks, Abigail. Richard, you have the final word. Where do you think you will be able to extend the work, and how do you
I think the biggest takeaway that we found was the amount of time it takes to do an analysis on a large data set is rather extreme. In our case, it took 6 months for one energy conservation program. And then after we did use those different methods, we honed in on the individual account regression method because it provided so much information after the analysis was complete. And then you have cooling, heating, and annual energy use information on a number of sites that then can show you a range of savings and max and min and mean and average and quartiles. And there's just so much information available there. So, and programming this method into a computer program and then using that for multiple EC programs was a big time saver.
Thank you, Richard. Phil? Close out? Any? Okay. Okay, I just want to say thank you, everyone, and thank you to the audience for your attention and for being able to attend this. I know there's more questions that came in. I'm sorry we couldn't address all the questions that came in, but we will try to figure out if there's a way to provide you a response, especially for those who asked the questions. I don't know what the system will be, but thank you again for everyone for your time. And thanks to the speakers.
Thank you.
Yep. These were the 3 presenters who had selected out of 260 abstracts that came into the session. So great job. Thank you.
Thank you.